Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How are you? I'm on quarantine day 33. I have dealt with broken computers, broken wires. I think the last time I put out an episode might have been either just after or just before my one cat spit up on my computer. Something he never does, because it was sitting on my desk overnight, and so he was up there, and I think he spit up on it, ruining one of the wires, and then about a week later, the logic board just died. So, let me tell you, folks. Difficult to get a computer fixed in the middle of a global pandemic. Global's redundant, is it not? Anyway, I'm here. And besides having insane allergies because I'm trapped inside an apartment 24/7 with the boys who I'm allergic to, things are about as well as you could expect in the pandemic. Apparently, podcasts are essential businesses in Los Angeles. So that's insane. But obviously, unless I'm going to have Naomi on every episode, I have to figure out some other way of doing this show. I have a backlog of about 6 episodes that I had recorded before the shelter-in-place orders, including Jeff Parker, who used to be in Tortoise, and his new jazz album is great, Jimmy Flemian from The Frogs, a bunch of other cool people, but I started doing them over Zoom. I've never wanted to do them over Zoom before because it's a technical pain in the ass. Number one, to try to get the other person to record their half of the conversation. And also, on the show, since we kind of get in deep about certain childhood things, it's, I think, kind of difficult to do that if you're not in the room with each other and you can't read each other's energy. And it's tough to know, like, oh, does that person want to talk about this thing or not? But I started doing them. Not bad. This one's pretty darn good. I talked to NIIKA Nemirovsky. I got sent her new album that's coming out in May, and I really liked it, and I thought she had an interesting story. If you don't know who NIIKA is, let me tell you a little bit about her bio. Today's episode, I talked to NIIKA Nemirovsky, a.k.a. NIIKA, with 2 eyes. Born in Uzbekistan in the wake of the USSR's dissolution, NIIKA and her family immigrated to Chicago when she was very young. Her music reflects being at the nexus of a number of different cultures, both on her 2017 EP Honest Dancing and her debut album Close But Not That Close, which will be out on May 15th, as I said before. And we talk about communism and capitalism. She was obviously way too young to really remember the USSR falling apart. But we talk a lot about, her parents raised under communism and late communism specifically. And we talk about that versus, growing up here in America under late capitalism, both crumbling economic and social systems. And we talk about Uzbekistan and what Uzbek culture is like, and a lot of other cool things. I like her music a lot, so check that out. I think I'll play a song of hers before we get into the interview. I'll keep this short, though. Thanks for listening. I got some other really cool interviews coming up, so if you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, I'm sure, a number of other places. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And I'm going to go take some Flonase, walk our dear Mabel, and go to bed. I hope you enjoy this episode. And I think I'm going to be, because I'm doing a number of these on Zoom now, I think I'll be doing this weekly for the duration of the pandemic. So, yeah. Okay. Well, I hope you guys are all safe and healthy and are social distancing. I gotta tell you, the people here in LA, not very good at signaling. And I'll tell you another thing. You go to, there's a kind of wealthier neighborhood. It's weird. You go about 2 blocks north of where Naomi and I live, and it's like kind of she. And they just don't give a shit about social distancing. They're not going to back down. They're going to make you get off the sidewalk, even if your dog is rolling in the grass and enjoying herself. You got to move. The rich people got to walk on the sidewalk. You poors can go stand in the street with your dumb dogs. Okay. Thanks so much for listening. And now, here's a song by NIIKA, and then our interview.
Out there on the dawn.
it's interesting having to get used to this new paradigm. Everything shifted about a month ago. Everything shifted from underneath us.
Yeah.
I was trying to think about that. I was wondering if you were in any way more prepared. You're not just you immigrated here. But at a young age, right?
Yeah. So I was born in Uzbekistan when it was like just after the Soviet Union split, and Uzbekistan actually hadn't reinstated its sovereignty, so it was sort of no man's land in 1991.
Interesting.
And I was born during that time there, and then my family immigrated here when I was about a year old. So in 92. So I grew up in Chicago, but I grew up Russian was my first language, and grew up very much like in Russian culture prior to going to school, because we immigrated here with my grandparents as well, and my parents were working, so I spent a lot of my time with my grandparents as a little kid.
What does that mean in terms of like sovereign nationality to be born when it's no longer part of the USSR, but it hadn't reinstated its sovereignty yet?
I mean, basically what it meant is that when we moved here, we don't have dual citizenship, because when we left Uzbekistan, like, people hadn't gotten new passports yet, like everything was just sort of in upheaval. So whereas most people, when they immigrate to a place, they'll have dual citizenship afterwards. That's not the case for me and my family. So even to go back to Russia now or back to Uzbekistan, we need to get visas. So that's basically that was the main, I guess, effect of that. Minus, just living through big political and social upheaval for my family.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. I didn't know if it, but I was like, oh, well, you were one, and I'm just curious if any of your parents' experiences in the Soviet Union, and then as that dissolves through the 1980s, if in some way the way that they live their lives, if that in some way set you up. Again, this is very broad, this question. If that somehow made you okay with, now that we're going through this major social upheaval,
right,
you're just kind of like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, this isn't great, but I kind of, feel it in my bones. In the same way that, my grandmother lived through the Great Depression, and she were Jews from Eastern Europe. So there's some kind of feeling in my bones where I'm like, yeah, I expected this forever.
Right.
I've always expected this in some way.
Yeah. I think that it's been a long time. Obviously, it's been 28 years, almost 30 years since all of that happened. Or 29. Yeah, almost 29 years. And I think that I definitely know that my family are a little more familiar with the idea of a governmental system breaking down. There is a little more yeah, it happens. This will happen. But I think that what's different is that capitalism here has a very strong and deep hold, and it's centuries long. And I think that I personally don't think that it's going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's going to change, but I don't think that we're on the brink of socialist revolt.
No.
Whereas communism was really broken for a while prior to the collapse of that system. I don't know. I think that because I was so young when we moved, I don't actually have a sense of it. I mean, I was born, I think, after the Soviet Union had already collapsed. So,
yeah.
I would be interested to ask my family about what those last few years were like, and if people were like, yeah, it's happening, or if it was still kind of a shock. Because I think,
I mean, did you grow up with a did you grow up just like a complete antipathy for communism? Like, this is garbage. I'm glad we're here in America. I mean, it's such a like double-edged sword because I imagine. I mean, I only know about like Russia now, really, which seems like very oligarch centric,
right, and hyper capitalist as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, what's interesting, we have someone that we know in our community that for a while was like really interested in communism and was like working with a communist like little publication and was like really touting it and came to my dad being like, I really believe in communism. And my dad was like, no, dude. It doesn't work. Like, I've been there, and like, yes, the ideals, the values might line up, but in practice, like, all of us who lived through it in the USSR, like, we all saw how broken it was and how much it didn't actually work in practice because corruption, because, power grabbing, because all the same things that show up in capitalism show up in communism as well.
Right.
But they're like way more covert, and the government has way more control and is literally rationing your food.
Yeah.
So it's funny because I think that a lot of us like really kind of hold up those values, but in practice, I think that like we've seen it through and through across the world, and it often looks very ugly. Even though it lines up with, this generation's like socialist kind of agenda. Go Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I grew when you grow up here, as you did, but I'm wondering what the difference is. I'm just like I'm projecting myself with you're bombarded, and my parents are my grandparents immigrated, so my parents are first generation, so I'm second, and you are inundated with capitalist propaganda. Like, I always think about when I was a kid and I would go to like a CD store and I would feel bad if I didn't buy something. Like, there was this weird compulsion in my brain where I'm like, well, I'm supposed to buy stuff.
Right.
That's how this works, right? And it would be like emotional or like a moral. There would be like this kind of feeling where I'm like, I should buy this, even if there's not a CD I want. And it took me a long time to get out of that. And it's interesting. It's like, oh, well, communism, we saw that didn't work. Obviously, we're living in this kind of like neoliberal, hyper-capitalist times that we see. I mean, obviously, like the very first thing that Congress did was pass a Wall Street bailout, and then another bailout that helped like the airline industry and things like that. With that, and only because of Bernie Sanders did what was there any kind of money thrown to the working class. So we see this doesn't work, and I'm like, well, where do you go from here? I mean, I'm not putting it on your shoulders, but I'm curious as to like how, like, if you grew up with parents who like lived through the corruption of communism in Soviet Russia, and then you come here and you see that this doesn't work out so well either. Like, I don't know how that makes you feel, or like how, like,
yeah. I think that the main thing that differentiates like how my family relates to resources from how a lot of Americans do, from what I've seen and from what I've observed, is that like there's a real I don't want to say even frugality. There is frugality for sure, but it's more like you don't throw away that vegetable because it looks kind of sad and it's got a little bit of mold on it. Like, you cut that bit off and you can throw it away, and then you use the rest of the vegetable. And you don't throw away plastic bags from the store. You put them in a little thing in the cupboard and you use them for your garbage can. And like, there's all of these things, and like, we've all driven all our family cars were driven into the ground. So it was a real like a preservation of your resources rather than like this disposable thing that happens. And that's, I think for me, was a really big adjustment once I like obviously got older and started living alone and living with roommates, was seeing people like throw stuff away prematurely, like throw food away that was just like, oh, I don't want this anymore. And
Right.
I was like, oh my God, like how can you be throwing away food? You know? And so that's something that I think is probably the biggest lingering thread from those times, because you just don't throw away half a loaf of bread because it's kind of stale. Like you freeze it or you cut it up and you make it into croutons or like whatever you want to do, but you do not put it in the garbage can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, and also, well, what I've realized, I actually was thinking about this today, is everyone's stuck inside and we're like, going to the grocery store is kind of a risk. And you just realize like, wow, like I cannot buy stuff for like 10 days and it's fine. And, because I think that on an average, on a daily basis, during normal time, whatever that is, you buy at least one thing every day. Like you're out and you buy a coffee, or you're out and you're like, oh, I need, batteries. So you go in and you buy batteries, and then you're like, oh yeah, and paper clips and some other shit that I forgot that I needed. And then you actually like, when you're forced to be inside, you realize like that compulsion that you're talking about to buy stuff is so ingrained in us and actually so unnecessary. Yeah. I was just thinking about that today, actually. It's funny.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about this, like how much food we wasted before, and now I'm like as long Naomi, like my wife Naomi, she showed me some, I forget, like maybe a pepper yesterday, and she's like, "Do you think this is okay?" I'm like, as long as it's not rotting, we have to use it, because we're going to the grocery store once a month maybe now.
Right.
So wait. Were you raised with any kind of political ideology?
Political? Yeah.
Like I was raised just like as I call my parents, I think they're called just yellow dog Democrats. They'll vote for whoever's a Democrat. So I was raised with this kind of mushy liberalism.
Yeah.
And then I had to like figure out my political ideology like in my 20s, like reading like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and those people. But I'm just curious.
I was raised, I don't remember like politics being like a very strong facet of my childhood until I was maybe like 11 or 12. It was, I think, after 9/11 or maybe right around the time of 9/11, and then like the Iraq War started and all the stuff.
Yep.
And at
the
that
neoliberal
time,
nightmare.
Yeah, at that
the neoconservative nightmare.
Or no, wait. I think I was in second grade when 9/11 happened, but the war had already been ramped up, and then I think there was an election happening or something, and around that time, my dad was like getting really into environmentalism and like becoming a lot more aware of that stuff. I feel like my mom's always been quite apolitical. Like she just doesn't sink into that stuff as much. But my dad's always been pretty passionate about things. And at that time, he was like really pushing to vote for the Greens. And who was that guy? What was his
Ralph
name?
Nader.
Nader, that's right.
Yeah.
I was like, Nader, am I wrong? Am I tripping right now? So he was really about him, but it's interesting because I think environmentalism also was a very new thing. Like it was a very American concept. Like environmentalism just didn't exist in Soviet Russia. Like I don't think that like idea really had any ground. And I think it took a lot of like learning and sort of a second revolution for my family and for my dad in particular, like I said, I think he's been the most influential person for me growing up as far as politics went. Yeah, so at that time he started getting a lot more passionate about environmentalism and human rights, and NPR became a facet of the radio playing in our house. And at that point I kind of, so it's always been on the left leaning side. And then my grandparents, so my dad's parents who are Jewish, have some friends who have family in Israel. And so there's like, the kind of further off Zionist.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So which my dad has always really rejected, and like he's been called an anti-Semite even though he's Jewish.
Yeah.
So anyway, it gets complicated. Of course, like that's like the right wing of, if you want to call it that, of like my family dynamic, is the more kind of anti-Palestinian, anti-Middle Eastern sentiments. But that's always been very hard, like pushed back against within my more nuclear circle in our family.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, that was kind of my upbringing, and I would say that I've taken that on, and then obviously furthermore developed my own social compass as far as human rights, climate belief, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what your parents did for a living, or how old were they when everyone came over here?
They were young. They were like 25. They had me really young.
Do they really do they have like occupations in the USSR?
Yeah. My mom was and is a pediatrician. But when they immigrated here, she had to kind of go through residency again and study for like the American medical exams. She didn't have to go to school again, but she had to like relearn everything in English, in a new language. And my dad was an electrical engineer. And he worked a bunch of odd jobs when we first got here, and was also studying English. And then he ended up working for Shure Microphones, actually. That was like his 9 to 5 when I was growing up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then he got way more into like sound work, and now he's a freelance sound engineer.
I don't like drawing linear kinds of things, but did that in any way influence you in terms of like pursuing music?
Definitely. I think that, well, it's funny because I feel like we all go through this cycle of like when we're kids and when we're teenagers, we really push back against our parents' influence. And then once we get a little older, it like seeps right back in.
Yes.
So I would say yes. Yeah. So definitely, if not the choice to pursue music personally, it definitely had a really huge influence on like my knowledge of music, the kind of music that I was exposed to as a kid, and like being taken to shows all the time when I was.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I went to so many shows that like were 21 and over as a kid. I was just like the tag along child that came to all the venues.
What, your parents brought you?
Yeah.
So like what kind of music? Like what bands?
All sorts of music. I feel like there was a lot of non-Western international artists. A lot of like classical Indian concerts, Middle Eastern, and then my dad was like pretty into prog rock when I was a kid, so definitely saw some like guitar dudes shredding. And yeah, I mean, I went to some really amazing shows as a little kid. Unfortunately, I fell asleep at a lot of them. I slept at a lot of those shows.
Sure, you're a kid.
Yeah. But I think that there was a lot of influence that sort of instilled itself in me early on.
Yeah, it's just interesting how much that stuff, like my dumb version or my dumb example is always like something like my parents would listen to like Billy Joel when I was a kid. And I don't like Billy Joel. I don't like Billy Joel that much now, but there is a kind of like, if you put like Moving On Anthony song on, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, that's not bad. That's a bop, as the kids say.
Yeah.
But there's just stuff that my parents listened to or did that like I was in trying to like figure out my own identity that I just went opposite of, or just moved not purposely opposite of, was just like, I don't know. There's just that weird kind of, I mean, so Freudian, that kind of like differentiation, like you push against, it's that dialectic of like pushing against, and then, you know, it's not, there's no necessary like opposite to Billy Joel, but I just ended up liking indie rock or whatever.
Right. I definitely especially in high school, I went through, you know, like I was like really into top 40 for like a year. And like I just remember, and like my first CD that I got as a gift when I was a kid was a Britney Spears CD. You know, the pink one. Was it called Hit Me Baby One More Time? Yeah. And you know, my dad always like has such a he really experienced grief over the fact that I was like listening to pop music, and I would always tell him like he was like, it's just tasteless. Do you know what taste is? And I would be like, yeah, I get it, but like, just, it's fine. Like, I like this right now. And I kind of had the wisdom as a kid to be like, I like this right now. It's okay. Like, I'll grow out of it, essentially. And that's what happened. And now a lot of the stuff that he exposed me to when I was a kid is what I actually reference in my music and like to listen to on my own time.
Yeah.
Plus everything that's good.
Sure. Yeah.
Not just that stuff, but yeah, it really like, I think it really came full circle for me. And especially with like, the term world music is really out, but like specific, types of music from other countries, like a lot of Indian classical, like Carnatic singing is like something that I really love, and I don't necessarily do it in my music specifically, but it really affects the way that I approach singing. And the way that I approach like melismas and all the little inflections really comes from that. And I've then begun to go back to that music and really listen in and like think about like how those people are using their voice. And anyway.
It's also funny when you said like world music. That is such an old genre. Like it's a term that was like when I was a kid and you heard world music, I was like, whatever, and it meant anything outside of America.
Right.
And then you grow up and you're like, oh, so wait, so world music doesn't mean an actual genre. It's like a foreign picture in the Oscars. Right. It's like, well, a movie from Uzbekistan is going to be different from a movie from Nigeria. I don't know why those are all somehow part of the same genre.
Lumped together.
Yeah. Like some kind of like African polyrhythm is not the same as Middle Eastern pop music.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty wild. And I really I feel very conflicted about that term, and yet somehow also like, because like maybe not in like the generation that's growing up now, but for my generation, like when we try and speak about music that's outside of the American pop canon, or the British pop canon. Like I feel like British and American, like English speaking pop canon,
Western pop.
It all of a sudden becomes so difficult to like classify, because there is such like there's this one line that even between like R&B, rock, fusion, like there's like American chordal structures or Western chordal structures, and like the Western scales and all of these things that kind of are this one commonality, and to then quickly reference something that lies really distinctly outside of that. I think like we still want to say world music, but it's just it does, like, it's very arrogant, I think, because it's the world, it's the whole world, rather than like it doesn't all fall into one lump. So I think
it's
my goal, I try to like just reference specific nationalities or ethnicities or countries from which the music comes, rather than, just lumping it all together.
It's interesting how like your consciousness in some way forms by the music that you grow up listening to. Like, I'm thinking about how like when I first started to be introduced to like whatever music from the Middle East, that it, because of the way that scales are different, are like formed differently than here, that it strikes my brain in a different way. It like doesn't feel when I listen to like Western canon music, there's a certain feeling of hominess. I don't know what the word I'm looking for really is. I'm just forming this thought as I'm talking, but there's a certain kind of like relaxedness to it, because my brain formed knowing like what to expect from those scales, or like from those chords. Like if I hear a C and I know it's a pop song, I know it's going to be an F or something, or a G or whatever like that. Whereas there's a certain kind of like, it's not anxiety, but there's definitely like a different feeling to listening to music, to listening to chord structures or scales that formed differently, that you don't grow up with. And in some way that forms how you think. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, this is so nerdy, but there was this episode of Radiolab where they talked about that piece, The Rite of Spring, by Stravinsky, and that when it was first performed, there was like a riot in the theater, and they kind of went into like why that happened, and that it was actually like it like caused such cognitive dissonance to what people understood and expected in music. And in a micro form, like when you show your grandparents like some heavy metal, they're like, this is awful. And it's kind of that same reaction of your brain just being like, I don't understand how to these like electrical signals, like abort. So I feel like it's a similar thing that happens, maybe not to the, like, we're not experiencing displeasure, but we don't experience that like comfort that you're talking about. But I also think that then what's happened for me, and something that like I have to like, I experience a push and pull with it, is that my desire is to actually like incorporate all of these various influences from like Russian ballads to like Uzbeki folk music to like Eastern European, like Bulgarian singers to Carnatic Indian music, and incorporate like those things that we don't necessarily expect into like a more quote unquote Western pop format. So what's happened, and I think that this is something that I'm going to be working on forever, but I'm still very much in the developmental stages of, is that I often write songs that end up kind of feeling maybe a bit disjointed. And that's like, I don't want to say just, that's a really like negative sounding word. But like I strive to combine things that aren't maybe what you would expect.
Yeah.
So like switching a time signature or like moving between chords that don't necessarily like fit together in the overall key of the song, or writing songs that aren't very like major or minor oriented. And because I also don't have theory, it's a lot harder for me to like actually put those things into practice sometimes. But that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I guess like what I've seen in a lot of music recently is that simplicity is really being championed in a lot of the bedroom pop, and the stuff that has become really popular in the last few years. I feel like simplicity is really being championed, and I guess that's where the battle comes in for me, is like I really see the beauty and the value in simplicity, but I get a little like nerdy, and I'm like, how can we turn this song on its head right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of like it's cool to be able to also vocalize that like all of those influences that are outside of Western pop music serve to sort of push my songwriting in a direction that maybe hasn't been explored before in that particular way. Or I don't know. I'm not saying that I'm like all original and that I have like I'm this prodigious non-Western songwriter or whatever. But that's kind of what pushes me
Right.
to try and write differently.
But it's interesting that these things, again, I like to use the word dialectic, like these influences are in you and pushing against each other in some way to create something novel. I think that's where a lot of the best art comes from. I like simplicity. And I think there are a handful of people that do simplicity well. But I'm personally not a fan of it. I mean, like, if I had my druthers, I would just listen to like minimalist composers for a lot of my time, or like anyone who's doing anything where I think there's a lot of stuff, a lot of music, a lot of the it's somehow where the chaos is contained. There's like there's like parts in the song that are butting up against each other, but there's something that contains it. So it's just not free floating nonsense. That's my personal favorite. And I think it's a lot more difficult to do that well.
Yeah.
Personally. I mean, that's just my taste. I'm not.
Yeah. I think there's a place for it all. And then
Sure.
sometimes you see or you find songwriters or composers that appear to be really simple at first listen, and then like once you try and actually understand what they're doing, you realize like there's so much complexity, and that's the best, is like you make it look easy, but then once someone tries to get into like either breaking it down or replicating it, they're like, oh my God, what is happening here? And that's really my goal. And I think that's one thing that I really kind of struggle with in not really having a handle on a lot of theory, is like, I think that when you have a bit of theory, you can just understand like how certain parts of music function and how to like better weave them together. So that's kind of, I think, my next challenge, my next hurdle is to get a little bit of a better grasp.
Is there some, if you think about Uzbekistan, is there like something that's Uzbeki culture that is somehow separate from Russian culture? I'm curious, like what, like in terms of like cultural, even if you didn't personally like experience it, like what was kind of transmitted to you of Uzbeki culture? What was kind of transmitted to you of Russian culture in the way that you were raised?
Well, Uzbeki culture is really different from Russian culture. Like Uzbekistan is in the Middle East, it's like Central Asia technically, but like it's a Muslim country. it's like the climate is really different from what most of Russia is like. It's like it's pretty warm. I would say like it's kind of like LA, but colder in the winter. It will snow there, but it's like pretty arid and like lots of fruit trees, and the culture is much more easy and kind of like relaxed than what I know to be Russian culture. And so what people think of as like the typical Russian immigrant in the States is pretty different from my family's like particular flavor of Russian culture. We're still Russian, and but then there's also the Jewish influence. My dad's dad immigrated from Ukraine like at the very start of World War II to Uzbekistan with his mom. And so there's like Ukrainian, Jewish, immigrant, refugee woven into it. So it's a really like particular flavor of Russian, I would say. And the Russian culture that I've experienced from people that grew up in Moscow or in St. Petersburg is very different from the culture that exists in my family. From food and just little nuances in communication and in energy and style and things like that. Yeah.
So I mean, is there a particular thing that like stands out to you? Like this is particularly Russian and this is particularly Uzbeki, and that's something that like this is it may not be like the core, but this is something that to me highlights this difference.
There's, I think that like, for me, it's funny that this is what stands out to me because I'm really into food and cooking and for just like gathering around food. That's like a really strong thing in my life. And I think that the particular way that looks in Uzbeki culture versus Russian culture is very different. Like, because Uzbekistan is really hot, they drink a lot of hot tea and they sit on the ground and they drink tea out of these little cups that look like tiny bowls. And they cook outside, and the food that was traditional to my family because they lived in Uzbekistan was very different from a lot of the food that's traditional in Russia. Like still a lot of like meat and potatoes and rice and stuff, but with a particular, so I think that really exemplifies it, is like it really grounds you in a particular kind of relationship with people when your food practices and your practices around, you sit down on the ground and you wear like a heavy coat even though it's summertime, and you're drinking hot tea and you're sweating, and you're like cooking kebabs on like the outdoor grill, and you've got fruit trees in your garden. And even though I never lived there, but I went there a couple times when I was a little kid, and it was like I have this like real image of it, kind of dusty, and I feel like what I've experienced of Russian culture, because I've also been to Russia a bunch when I was a bit older, it's a lot more like it's much more Western in how people relate to each other, and I would say there's maybe a little bit more formality. It's but it's pretty hard to put it into words as well. Russian culture also, I think, is much more like hard. There's a lot of toughness.
Yeah.
And even beyond toughness, what you see is like there's this it's a very principled culture. So there's kind of a lot of more rigid structures about political ideas, or like gender roles or whatever it might be. And not to say that that didn't exist in Uzbekistan in its own way, but I think that at least in what I've experienced with my family and our family friends who were also from Uzbekistan, there's a bit more fluidity in a lot of ways that I haven't seen necessarily in traditional Russian culture. And like Russian immigrants, like all live like in the suburbs and, you know, like drive big fancy cars and it's really money oriented, or that not all, but a lot of what I've seen. Like a lot of my parents' friends from when we were new in America, who came from other parts of Russia, they really went into that other direction, whereas I feel like my family, I don't know. Anyway, these are all very specific examples as well. Like, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily, like, true of all Uzbeki people. Or
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm not asking you to speak for all of that.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about how, like, in your mind, what are these differences, and then how do those differences... or how did the culture that you were brought up in, what was it, and then how did that influence you as a person? Because I think that to me is more important, or more shows like why you choose to do the things you do. Because I also think it's interesting, you are 0th generation, I guess, technically. And you go into music, and it could be that, you know, you are the generation... I'm older than you, but I think we're close enough that, like, to me, 2008, like the kind of financial crash really was just like, well, I might as well go do the thing I wanted to do. And even though I come from like a Jewish family that wanted a doctor or a lawyer.
Right. Yeah.
You know, oh, well, there's no guarantee. That doesn't mean you are guaranteed anything anyway. So I might as well do the thing that fulfills me. Yeah.
I think also for my family, and it's interesting, I've seen this with one of my bandmates who sings as well. She her family immigrated from Greece, and she was born here, but she was born not too long, I think, after at least her dad immigrated. Her mom grew up here and her dad grew up in Greece. And what I've seen as kind of a parallel between both of us is that our parents and grandparents, like, kind of went through a bit of stuff in the process of immigration and leaving a home. And there definitely has been pressure in my life for me to, like, get a stable career and make money and marry up and do all the stuff. Like, it's also been simultaneously met with this energy of, like, but I want you to just love your life as well. Like, yes, money and stability are important, but there's also been this kind of really deep support that I think that in American culture, from what I've seen, when kids really stray away from their parents' desires, there's sort of this, like, real clashing of ideologies and of beliefs and of value systems. And there's often, like, a real rift that happens where I feel like in my family, even if I do everything opposite to how my parents or my grandparents wanted me to do it, there's, like, just this deep love that kind of is the undercurrent and is the basis. And that doesn't mean I won't get scolded or I won't have my ear talked off every time I go to a family member's home about you know, whatever it is that I'm not doing quite right at the moment. They're still really naggy. But there's also just, like, a deeper current, which is that there's a desire for me to be happy. And I really value that. And I think, you know, that might not exist in all immigrant relationships, but I think that exists in a lot of immigrants' minds, because I think that maybe there's a vein of, like, well, I know what it's like to have left my home and left what I knew and left what was expected of me to like go and live a better life, whatever that meant for me. And while I might not agree with my child's decisions, you know, I think that there's a deeper understanding of what it means to like say, you know, betray or say goodbye to what you were brought up with because you see your path to happiness as something different. That's maybe just a way to intellectualize the way that functions in my experience.
I mean, is that just particular to your family, like, or idiosyncratic of your family, or is there something of that in Uzbeki culture, that kind of thread that you were talking about?
I wouldn't, you know, it's funny because Uzbeki culture, it's hard to speak about Uzbeki culture for me because while my family did all grow up there, Uzbeki culture in its essence is very different from what they were brought up in or what I was brought up in, because while my family lived there, it was like Uzbeki culture was very much suppressed. Like religion was suppressed, language was suppressed. You know, Russian was the national language rather than Uzbeki. You know, Muslim practices were suppressed, as well as Christian and Jewish and whatever else. But so I wouldn't necessarily say that like my family's cultural practices are Uzbeki in their nature, because Uzbeki culture is, I think, much better reflected outside of, you know, so the Soviet era, so before and after. So it's hard for me to say if that's Uzbeki. I think I would say that that's how I understand immigrant culture.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more like, so your parents really grew up in this kind of like what I would think of as like the stereotypical repressive Soviet era.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Like,
mean, like, you know, like rations. They, like, my parents, it only like recently clicked how crazy this was, but every summer they were required to go to like to pick cotton for like a month and a half or 2 months every summer. Like all kids of a certain age group.
Huh.
Like every summer they would go and pick cotton as like a part of the Soviet structure. And for them it was like kind of like camp, because it was a bunch of kids together, like in bunks,
Sure.
you know, in dorms. But they were working, like, and they had to like meet a quota when they were like teenagers. So they did definitely grow up in that. But also you see, like, what I think I also now understand is like all of this sort of scary language that we impose upon like communism and like these really repressive government systems is like, I never understood that was the way the government was until I started learning about Soviet Russia as an adult or as a, you know, a college student. Mm-hmm. Because that's never how my parents spoke about it, because they still found joy and they had friends and they were in theater groups and they, you know, roamed the streets and hung out with boys and girls and, you know, like they did all this stuff. It wasn't like they were repressed in their essence, but a lot of people's like larger structures were repressed. So like whether it was religious practice or language or finances, you know, there was a lot of repression, I think, but maybe because my parents moved when they were pretty young, like 25, they kind of didn't understand the gravity of what it meant to be like tamped down by this system.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, it's just strange. Like everything is good and everything is bad at the same time. Like Stalin was a monster, but also life expectancy went up by, I think, decades during the Stalinist era. Right. Something like that. It went up like a crazy amount. Uh-huh. So it's just like, you can't, not every, you know, there's terrible repression and there's like, you know, secret police, but also like your parents didn't have, they weren't thrown in a gulag somewhere. They were allowed to, join theater groups, and they were allowed to,
Right.
It's.
I think they were also living through like the late stage of it. I think maybe at a point where it wasn't as like scary. I think there definitely was a lot of really terrifying stuff that happened, and people were killed and thrown into gulags, and so there definitely were those things. But I don't think that, at least for young people, I don't think that that's what stuck out at the time. It was like, you don't say nasty things about the government on the phone or whatever it might be. But you don't, I don't know. I think that wasn't like the main theme of their lives.
Right. Again, not to like bring us full circle, but there is something about this time that we're living through that you start to understand other parts of history where you're like, I have a friend that I had on the show a while ago. He's a comedian and he's from Iran, and he was there during the war in the 80s. And he's like, your life goes on. Yeah. There's a war going on outside, and sometimes you have to like be inside and you turn the lights out because there's bombs going off, and you don't want them to like target your apartment building or whatever. Right. But you live your life otherwise, and when there are these extraordinary circumstances, or you're living under oppressive governments or whatever it is, your life still continues, and you still have to figure out how you're going to do what you want to do, if it's even possible. It's interesting, I think, also too, that like my dreams, my existential dreams were formed in a different world almost. And now it's like, should I still be a comedian? What am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah. I think that's really true, and we're seeing a lot of that happening. Like we're doing this interview over Zoom instead of in person, and you're seeing a bunch of musicians doing live streams instead of playing shows. A lot of them are hating it, but that's for another day. And people are really. I mean, what's craziest to me is like, I saw a friend post the other day, like, we're living through in the Twilight Zone, and he posted this link to an article, which I don't know how, I kind of just like checked it out. It didn't look super well researched or well thought out, but it was like Trump is looking at expanding Medicaid and Medicare for all, and like had a quote that said like, I don't think it's fair that there's all these uninsured people in America, because he doesn't want to deal with the financial repercussions of millions of uninsured people being stuffed into the medical system because we have a health crisis on our hands. And it's like, yeah, you're literally speaking the agenda of the socialist Democrat candidate that everyone is saying is too radical. And, but like that, what I'm trying to make, the point that I'm trying to make by saying that is that like, we're seeing like these crazy adaptations of what we thought was not possible if A, B, and C happened. And it's now just like our reality. People being sent checks in the mail, and like unemployment being expanded to freelance and gig workers, and like all these crazy measures of like, yeah, just stay home. You don't have to come into the office and commute for 2.5 hours every single day. Like it's wild, and it's also kind of beautiful, I think, because it's just kind of revealing how arbitrary a lot of these systems are.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. Yeah, that they're also, that you find out that a lot of them are just systems of control that are not needed. Yep. Well, thank you for trying this experiment. Having one of these interviews over Zoom. How do you feel?
Feel good.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. bio.